For today's class, we are going to be talking about functions. What are functions? Functions are code block that are executed only when they are called. It's a code block that you define. They sit there and they don't do anything until you call them. I know I've mentioned to us what code block is. Code block is anything inside here. The starting of the parenthesis and the closing of the square bracket and the closing of the square bracket. If I do console log here, hello world, this code is going to execute hello world. So this is not a function. But a function is a code block that you will write and they will not execute until you call them. Or in programming terms, invoke. Invoke like this. So if you don't invoke a function or call the function, the code block will not execute. How do we write a function? How do we write function? Function syntax. So if you want to write a function, you start with a keyword function. So before I define this, let me give you a quick example. So look at these two different. Look at these two code. Remember I told you that code block start from the opening and closing. And I told you that a function is also a code block, but it will not be executed until you invoke it. So you look at this. This is a starting and closing. So this is a code block. The only difference is these things that are before it. And I will explain this in a few. So if I run this code, you are going to get only hello world because this function will not be executed until you invoke it. So the question now is, how do you call a function? After defining a function, how do you call it? To call it, you mention the name, followed by the parenthesis, and when you execute this, you see that the code executes. So this is an example, so let's take it step by step. Function syntax. How do you define a function? You define a function by one, starting with a keyword function. This keyword function, you see here, this is where we define a function. The function started with a keyword function. When I say a keyword, it means reserved word in JavaScript. They are unique word in JavaScript, like this console that we've been using, this is unique for JavaScript. So this function is a unique keyword, just like var, let, and const that we've learned in our previous classes. Function is another keyword. So in order for you to define a function, you have to start it with that keyword function. Now, followed by the variable, that is the function name, followed by the function name, in this case, greet. Your function name follows the rules of naming variable. You should understand this. Remember all the rules of how you name your variable. The same rule applies to when you are creating a function and giving it a name. So this is the first one, the function keyword, followed by the function name, which follows the rules. Let me put it here, so when you're looking at these notes, you don't get confused. The second item here is the function name, and your function name must follow the rule of naming variables. You know those rules already because we've learned it. You can go back to check to refresh your brain. I will just mention a few. I told you that a variable cannot start with a number. The same with a function name. You cannot start with a number. I told you that you can start a variable with a $sign or underscore. You can do the same here with function. You can start with $sign or you start with underscore. These are valid names. And your variable name can also be more than one word, and you can apply the same variable naming rule of snake case, camel case, and Pascal case. You can apply that rule here. So if I want to say greet all, two words, I can do this, greet all, or I do greet underscore all. These are valid function names. So those rules apply when you are getting your function name. One thing I also have to tell you is that your function should always, you should always name your function based on what the function is doing. For example, I named this greet because I have in mind of printing hello world, which is a greeting. So that's why I call it greet. So you name your function based on the activity of that code block. You can also call it a named code block. A named code block. If grasping the concept of function is hard, you can just see it as a named block, a code block that is given a name. And how do you give that a name is by using this syntax, starting from a function, followed by the function name, which is greet. Now, the third item there is followed by a parenthesis. This is parenthesis. Followed by this parenthesis, you can see it here. That is the syntax of writing a function. You start from the function, followed by the function name, followed by the parenthesis. This is a compulsory format of defining a function. Then your parenthesis can have parameters. Parentheses can contain parameters separated by commas. So you see here, we defined this function without parameter. I will talk more on this, but just have this on a side note. Your parentheses can have parameters. And when it has parameter, the syntax is like this. Parameter 1, comma, parameter 2, comma, parameter 3, depending on how many parameters you want to pass, and so on and so forth. There's no cap to how many parameters you can pass to your function, but make sure that each parameters are separated by a comma. That's the most important thing. But you can give your function as many parameters as possible. So the fourth item is to end the definition with a code block or square brackets, which is this. Square bracket, that is where you have your code block. Within the square bracket, that is where you will write your code that you want to be executed when you call the function. You see it here. So start with the function keyword, followed by the function name, in this case, greet. The namings are using the variable naming rules. The third item is to follow it by the parentheses, which can have parameters. Then the fourth one is to open the code block where you want to write your statements. So if we look at this example here, you see that we start with a function followed by a name, which is in this case greet, followed by the parentheses with then the code block. Remember, this is our code block without a name. This is the same code block, but in this time, we have given it a name. Thereby, this will not execute when we run our code without calling it, but this will execute because it's a code block that is not given a name. So it's going to execute straight away. So how do you call a function? If you want to call a function, you mention the name in which you use to create that function, which in other words, the identifier. Remember, when you create a variable and you want to use that variable, you have to mention the variable name wherever you want to use it. For example, var x equals to 0, and you want to make use of x in another variable, you might say var z equals to x. Because we want to reference this value, we mention the identifier name. The same thing with function. If you want to call a function, you reference it by the function name. So once you call the function name, you follow it by the parentheses. Let me note this down in case you are coming to this document in the future to help you understand this. So this is calling a function. I told you that this can also be called as invoke. So invoking a function. So that when someone mentions invoke that function, it shouldn't look like the person is saying something else. So it's calling a function or invoking a function. How do you do that? The first thing is the syntax. the syntax is to mention the name of the function. Mention the name of the function, then followed by parenthesis. Remember, I told you that your parentheses can have parameters. This is where you need to pass the value of your parameters. If your function has a parameter, this is where you pass the value. For example, if your function has a parameter, then you pass in the values in the parentheses like this: value 1, value 2, value 3, depending on how many parameters that your function expects. That is how many value you will pass to it. So let us demonstrate this again. Let me remove this one. So we have a function here which follows this syntax explained up here. Now, for us to call the function, this is how we call it. Mention the name, which is the identifier, followed by the parenthesis. And that is how you invoke a function. If I don't do this, this code will never print out anything. It will not print out anything because I have not invoked the function. Then if I do this and I run my code, you will see hello world from a function telling you that this is the code block that was executed. So this is how to invoke a function. When you do this, you are calling that function to execute your code. Now, it doesn't matter. There's no number, there's no limit to how many functions you can define in your code. You can define as many as, but just make sure that the names are different. For example, we can define another function that says welcome. For example, then we do console.log welcome to JavaScript. So if I execute this code, you see I still get hello world from a function. This is not executing because we have not invoked it yet. So to invoke this function, the same rule apply. Mention the name, welcome, followed by the parenthesis. And when we run this now, you will get welcome to JavaScript as well as the greet. Now, why do we need a function in the first place? Function is good because we can execute it multiple times, as much as we want. If we have just code block like this code block will only execute once, and there's no way to call it again and again. This is a block. No way to call this again and again. It will only call once, and that is it. This is the block I called, and that is it. But with your function, you can call it as many times as you want. We can duplicate this and invoke it again and again and again and again. JavaScript will not complain. It will just run the same code block again and again. So if we run this, you see how many hello world from JavaScript is how many times that you invoke the function. You can see welcome, you can see hello world. How many times you invoke this function, it will run the same code block. It will just execute the same code block. Now, I mentioned something here about function having a parameter. If we want to have a parameter, you pass it in the parentheses. While you are defining your function, you pass in the parameter name. While you are invoking the function, you're passing the value. This is two different things. Now, let's make a function with a parameter. Greet with param. So the parameter that we need here is the name of the person we want to greet, followed by the code block that we want to execute. Let me remove this. So greet with param, or naming it according to what it does, greet with name. Greet with name. So this is going to have a name. In this case, we are going to do console log hello plus the name. Now, remember I told you here, you pass in it, the parameters in the parentheses, and there can be multiple. In this case, we have only one. Now, I call it parameter 1 here. This is a placeholder. Your parameter 1 can be anything. And again, the naming uses the same rule as variable names. The name that you put in as your parameter name uses the same rule as naming your variable. So see this parameter as a variable that you are declaring, but just not with the var or let or const. See it as you defining a variable. That is your parameter. Now, this is using your parameter value. You see here, I mentioned the exact identifier which is passed under the parameter. Now, if you want to call this parameter, this function that has parameter, it goes the same syntax. Let me remove these multiple calls so we have more clarity. So you follow by the name, you start by the name, followed by the parentheses. Now, if you look at this pop-up here, it's telling us that this function requires some parameters. It's showing us here that we need a value here. So now, this is where you pass the value for your name. So if your name is a string, you pass in your value with a quote to say Lovette. That is the name you pass to this identifier here. So see this one as when you are initializing the variable. Imagine that you do var name and you come down and say name equals to Lovette. This is the same thing here. We created a function with a parameter. See this as the variable name. Then when you are calling it, you pass in the value. See this as assigning the value to this variable name, which is in this case like this in variable concept. If I run this code now, you see here, hello Lovette is printed, which means this value that I passed in here gets assigned to this name, and in turn, it is concatenated to this hello with the plus operator, which we've learned in the past class. So I told you can have multiple variables. So let's try functions with two variables, hello name and age. So I will say hello, the name, and I also want to log how old the person is. So you are age, you are X years old. So this will be greet with name and age. So you see, this one has one parameter. This one have two parameters or two arguments. You can also call it arguments or parameters. Those two names can be interchangeable. So your name here is what you have to reference within your code block. And this name here is only visible in this code block. You cannot mention outside this code block anything you put in your parameter. So it's only visible here. It's like a black box. So if we call this function and pass in the name, so remember I told you when it has two parameters, when you are invoking the function, you have to pass the value 1 and value 2 because you have two parameters. The first value you pass to your function will be assigned to the first parameter. The second value you put in your function when you invoke it is going to be assigned to the second parameter. So even if we change this thing like this, if we change it to start with 30, then name here is just going to assign 30 to name, and it's going to assign your name to age. So bear that in mind. The order in which you create the variables should also be the order in which you pass in the values. So if you call this, then you will get, hello, peculiar, you are 30 years old. Now, if we pass more than what our function is expecting, JavaScript is just going to ignore the extra because there's nothing to assign it to. Now, this is not the case for Python because you will get an exception if you do this. But JavaScript just ignores the extra values that you pass in. But if you add one more parameter here, then it's going to assign it to it. So, any question at this point before we move ahead?
No question.
Everything is clear to this point. Cool.
If I said, I think it's clear, but there's something I have in mind. Like, what if I'm still talking about these parameters, eh?
Mm-hmm.
What if this age now is in this name, age, and other stuff is in an object somewhere within the code snippet, and you're calling that object as a parameter in your function? Will it still print run the code that is in that object? Let's say you create this name, age.
Get a function,
Hmm?
greet all, for example, and we want to pass in names.
Age and address, something like that.
Yeah,
Okay.
but okay, let's say greet person. Then you pass in the information as object.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So when you do this, it means that the same rule applies, right? When you define an object. So your object has properties.
Yes.
So those properties is what you will use here. So you can say the same thing that we have here, and in this case, it will be maybe person, for example, because of the name, greet person. So you pass in person. Then here will become person.name, and here will become person.age. And when you are invoking this function, you are going to have something like this. Remember that your function is expecting an object. So you are going to put in an object. Then you put the name and you pass in the name. And you age. Now, when you run this, you will get exactly the same. You see your result here.
Yeah, I get it. But still, what I was thinking, maybe what I'm saying in essence is, could you just create this person's function somewhere within the block, and then call it like, let's say, as you say, greet person, and then you pass object person. Do you understand what I'm saying?
So if I get you, you want to define this
The object
this
somewhere.
object
Mhm.
person like this.
Yes. And
It's
then
the same.
when you are calling the function, you just pass in person object inside.
It's the same. Yes, you pass in the variable. Your variable is a representative of this.
Yes.
So this works the same. Do you understand now?
Yes. Yes.
So this is the path we were going, but yeah, we've discovered it via question, which is also good. So it's not necessarily that you pass in this value directly like this. You can decide that you want to create a variable, say name equals to Lovett and age equals to 40. Then we want to greet the one that has name and the one that is expecting name and age, which is this one. We can call it here and pass in name as the first parameter and age as the second parameter. And when we execute this, you get the last result there. Hello, Lovett, you are 40 years old. So you can also define your values in a variable, then call the function. So now there's one more part in a function that you need to know. In as much as your function accepts values, it can also return value. So in order for your function to return a value, you use another keyword called return. Returning a value from your function. So you use the keyword return. Use the keyword return. So just like your function is a keyword, return is also a keyword. So when you return in your function, whatever you return will be accessible outside of your function. So when you invoke the function, you can assign it into a variable, and that variable will receive the value that that function is returning. So let us give an example. Let's comment this one so that we have clean log. So we have a function, let's say sum A and B. Remember, this is exactly the same format with this example we have here. Because I named it A and B, that's just my variable name. I can name these two things anything I want, provided that it follows the rule of the variable naming. It's acceptable. So I have a function called sum. I want to sum these two values. So remember I told you that when you want your function to return a value, you use the keyword return. So we want to return the sum of A plus B. This function expects a return. Now, if we invoke this function, console, if we invoke this function, let's start from this. If we invoke this function and we run this code, you see that there's nothing in our console because we have not asked this function to print anything to the console. But we are calling this function, and this function returns a value. So if we want to get the value that this function is returning, then we have to declare a variable to collect that value. So we do var value equals to sum. Do you understand now? So if you want to retrieve this value that is coming from this sum, we are going to assign it to a variable. This variable can be anything. I call it value, but it can be anything. Remember, it's a variable name. So you can name it anything you want. But followed by the equal sign, then invoke your function, the same syntax that you use to invoke your function. Now, our function requires two parameters that we want to sum. So we want to sum 2 and 5. Remember that the function is going to return A plus B, which more or less is going to return 2 plus 5. And our value is going to have that thing, and we can log it here as our value. And if you run this, it gives you 7. Because 2 plus 5 is 7. Remember what I told you about function? This is where the beauty of function comes to play. We can call this function multiple times, passing in different value, and we will get different results. So let's call this value 1. So we can duplicate this multiple times of our choice and call different value for A and B, 5 and 9, say 3 and 3, say 1 and 2, say 4 and 2. So these are all different values, and they are going to return different results. So for your value 2, for your value 3, 4, and 5. So if we run this code, you see here, the same function returning different values based on what we pass to it. This is 3 and 3. This is 5. The first one is 7, 2 plus 2. The second one is 14, 9 plus 5. You see it here. The second one, the third one is 6. You see it here. The fourth one is 3. You see it here. And so forth. 4 and 2 is also 6. You see it here. So this is the beauty of writing a function. When you see yourself repeating a line of code over and over again, it should give you a tip that you need to create a function for that. So instead of me writing a code all the time, doing this plus this plus this, all I have to do is define a function that adds two items for me, and I can pass it to them and get the summation without repeating myself all the time. So this is the beauty of having a function. Now, this is the simplest part of a return. You can also do some complex operation at the top of your function before returning the value. And I'll give you another example. Let's say function calculates A, B, C. So we can say here, the result equals to result for AB equals to A plus B, and result for, and the final result is the result B, AB times C. Then we want to return the result. So this is just an example. You can do complex operations here and return the final result of what you want out. Then here we can call this. Remember, we passed it in a variable. It's not a must. We can also pass it directly to your console without assigning it into a variable. So we do the 3 values and we run this, you get a 9. So what this does is A plus B, which is 3 times 3, which is 9. So you see, it gets you that result. You can also assign it to a variable. F equals to calculate 3, 8, 10. And here you log your variable F, which will give you the value 110. This is the same function with returning different value based on the input. So these values here are also known as inputs. This is the input that you give to your function. Then this is the output that gets to assign to this variable. That's the output. So your output is this return that gives the output, which is this. Whatever your function returns can be any data type. It can be integer, it can be string, it can be object, it can be array, it can be a Boolean.
Okay.
Remember that JavaScript is dynamic type. So whatever your function return is going to be assigned to this variable, and it will automatically take the data type. And when you print here, it's going to be exactly the value you expect, or exactly the value your function returns. The console is just printing your output.
Good.
So whatsoever your function is doing, console does not know about it. It is whatever your function outputs. Let's say, for example, I come here and I return Nkim without returning anything that I did here. If I run this code, how many times I call a function, it will always return Nkim. even though I'm passing it values, it will always return Nkem because that is what I returned. Even though I'm doing some calculations here, console or anybody using the function outside does not know what is inside. Like I said, it's like a black box. So you get an input, then anyone using your function expects or receives the input. Your function can be a function that does not return an output, or it can be a function that returns an output. And whatever output you return is what the user of the function will receive. So in this case, we are returning a calculated result. And that is why you get those values based on the input, because the result is gotten based on the input. Do you understand now? That is the reason why we put parameters in our function, because we want to change the result or the behavior of the code based on the input. If I have this input and decide not to use it within my function, let's say I just had code 3 here and 5 here, and I get my result and times it with maybe 2, without using this input that I'm expecting, my code will always return the same result. You see it, 16, 16. Because my calculation is all hard-coded, I did not reference the input that I'm expecting. So these inputs were assigned correctly, but our function implementation refused to use it. So it is more or less useless.
Okay.
Unless you use the inputs, that is when your function behavior will be dynamic or changes based on the input.
Okay. Gotcha.
So, did I manage to explain that correctly?
Yes, yes.
Good. I don't want to go into if statement here because we have not discussed it. I don't want to introduce that into here. When we get there, we are going to write a function that uses if statement. So when you define a function that returns an output, when you use the return keyword, anything under any statement you write after the return keyword will not be executed. So your return is like a terminator. It terminates the execution of the code and returns the output. So if we come down here and put console.log end, if we run this code, we will not get that console. You see here, because this return terminates the execution of this code block. So if you want this to be executed, you have to put it before the return statement. So when you run this code, then you get end. Is it clear? This, you know what console.log does, yeah?
Yes.
Just prints to the console. So I'm saying that if you are writing your function within this code block, once the JavaScript playhead reaches to this keyword return, it will return the value immediately and ignores every other thing underneath, which is what I made a test here to say this is the end. So this one now is before return. So this is after return. So this one will be executed, but this one will not, because this return will terminate the execution. So if I run this code, you see before return, but there's no after return. Is it clear what I mean now?
Yes.
So whenever you want to write your function, always take note of this. When your code reaches the return, that is the end of that function block. I think we have to end it here. We've spent quite a lot of time. So let us give an assignment. So task 7, define a function that prints your information, which means this function does not have a parameter. Whenever it is invoked, you should just print your information. Also, define a function that accepts 2 parameters and prints the 2 parameters. And the third one is define a function that accepts 3 parameters. It should sum the first and the last and divide by the second parameter and return the results. Invoke this function and log the output. Do the same for all the functions, by the way. You should invoke all of them in order for us to see the results. Thank you, and talk to you in the next class.